Well, hello, it's me, and as promised, I wanted to make a short video having to do with forgiveness, the how to apply forgiveness, how to live it out. So I will keep this short. I'm going to post underneath the video the notes that go along with it, and as a little bit unusual for me, I'm going to read quite a bit of this, but it's 5 short paragraphs, and I wanted to make sure that what I said is actually what you could follow along with in the notes. So let's get started. Let me get through this. Forgiveness is, in fact, a beautiful inward and outward transformation. You can do this, okay? You can become this. You were meant to do this. The key thought here is to remember that it is not the act of forgiveness that we're interested in, but rather to grow into becoming a forgiving person. This is the will of God, not to go into a 911 emotional state when something happens and you don't know how to forgive and you get frustrated and you get bitter. The whole purpose of teaching, Jesus' teaching on forgiveness, is not to parcel out forgiveness, but for you and I to become forgiving people so that we don't go into a tailspin, so that it's a part of who we are. That's the key thought, to become forgiving people. So number one, forgiveness recognizes something unfortunate has happened. Forgiveness doesn't pretend or feel the need to deny. It doesn't create a fantasy. Forgiveness is not avoidance. Forgiveness isn't suppressing. Forgiveness isn't dismissive. Forgiveness is not the idea of bargaining and punishing someone with your coldness. In other words, they've hurt your feelings, and you're just going to pretend it didn't happen. You're going to stuff it. That's not what's needed. Forgiveness does not ignore the offense, and that's where we get off to start with. We think something happened, I'm mad, and I'm just going to forget about it. Well, depending on the size and the effect of the offense, it might be something small that you actually do forget. But if it's something big, and I think that's what we're talking about here, forgiveness looks squarely at the offender and the offense, but instead of retribution, forgiveness offers to pour love and grace into it. And I'm going to help you do that. So that's first. Forgiveness actively, consciously confronts personally both the offender and the offense. It doesn't pretend. That's the first thing. Let's not go into pretend. Two, forgiveness realizes, yes, I too at some junctures have offended God by my own mistakes and by my own sins. Well, why does that matter? Because for forgiveness to really be effective, you need to create a sense of empathy with the one who has offended you. And by the way, we are always very quick. Every discussion I've almost ever had in groups, big or small, or individuals, it is always about how someone has offended us. Rarely have I sat at a table with anybody who outwardly said, in this case, I was guilty. I'm the perpetrator. We always think about forgiveness in terms of what happened to me. We rarely are the one who says, you know what, actually, I'm guilty. So we usually see forgiveness in a very kind of a jaded sense. Number two, forgiveness realizes, yes, that I too have sins. I have made mistakes. I have neglected people. And so what it does is it creates a sense of empathy towards the one who has offended you. When you realize that your hands are not always clean, your heart is not always clean, you too have needed forgiveness, and you remind yourself of that, then it levels the playing field. It doesn't come off as you the judge and somebody else is your emotional slave. So yes, he offers forgiveness. It's the place of empathy, to realize that each of us has personal struggles and sins and inconsistencies, moments of thoughtlessness, that there are certain areas in my life and your life that are not developed. Maturity requires a heart for others, not an excuse, but a heart. We are all wounded by sin, and we have all sinned. So remember, we are not just perfect, but we actively have sinned, and we need God's forgiveness. Forgiveness may take time, and that's important. Our empathy and understanding and patience benefits both the offender and the one who has been offended. Our level of forgiveness truly reveals how deep Christ has been formed in us. So first, forgiveness recognizes that something has happened. Two, forgiveness realizes that I too have needed forgiveness, and yet God has released me. Not made an excuse, but He has offered forgiveness. Three, and this is where the application gets a little more intense. Forgiveness intentionally releases a debtor from the debt. That is what forgiveness is in terms of its definition. What does forgiveness do? Forgiveness says there's a debt, an apology, or something owed here, but I am intentionally releasing you from it. It is the act of refusing to hold emotional hostages. Forgiveness results in personal freedom from harboring grudges. It releases you from bitterness, resentment, and retribution, and the emotional coldness. So what happens is, many Christians know that salvation is not of works. We don't have a works-based relationship with God, but we have works-based human relationships, and that is why your grudges and your bitterness run so deep. You don't have grace relationships with people. You have works-based human relationship. We are aware that salvation comes from God without works. It's a free gift, lest any of us should boast. We understand that about God. What we don't understand is that we are not to have works-based relationships with one another. So leave your works-based personal relationships with people and enter into mercy and grace as you have entered, if you have, entered into mercy and grace with God. God says, vengeance is mine. So vengeance is not your emotional property or mine. I don't own vengeance. Let the Lord be the agent of His own discipline. But even in the release, it feels to you like you're letting somebody get away with something. And that's what the part that bothers you, that something wrong has taken place, and you don't want to forgive because they're getting away with it. But God says, vengeance is His. And once you come to grips with the fact, you already know that nothing has escaped the attention of God. He will deal with this in His time. Your role and mine is to surely, if need be, an honest confrontation can take place. You can have a discussion with someone who has offended you. But the purpose of confrontation is always, always restoration, not retribution. Not you just exacting the last pound of flesh. So forgiveness intentionally releases a debtor from the debt. So one, forgiveness recognizes something has happened, and I think we're trying to be clear on that too. Forgiveness realizes that I too have needed forgiveness. That secondly creates a sense of empathy, that we're in this together. I may not have done exactly what you have done, but I have done other things that needed forgiveness also. Three, forgiveness releases willingly a debtor from the debt. Four, and this is where this gets the beauty of the Lord begins to shine forth in this. Four, forgiveness recreates relationships. Let me say that again. Your forgiveness recreates relationship. Love not only doesn't keep a record of wrong suffered, but love seeks to intentionally infuse hope and love, care, safety, and growth into a relationship. Forgiveness says, currently, because of my grudge and my bitterness and my anger and my hurt, I have this relationship. But forgiveness recreates a relationship. It says, I don't want this relationship. And even if the offender, now listen, even if the offender is unrepentant, even if they don't care, even if they are cynical, and they go and brag, even if they brag on how they offended you, you can still release them from your point of view. Because forgiveness says, I'm seeking to do for others what God did for me. to not only lay aside retribution, but to proactively become the source of blessing. This is very important for me to communicate to you. You and I were called to the ministry of reconciliation. We were called to be the agents of forgiveness. God's grace, glory, and forgiveness, we are conduits. We are to serve as conduits for His grace, His glory, and forgiveness. Forgiveness recreates relationships. So, I'm not giving license to bad behavior, but at the moment that the offense and the sting takes place, and I'm not asking you tonight to deny it, I'm saying to recognize, in the same way that God, through the person of Jesus Christ, He recreated His relationship to you through Christ, through the willful act of forgiveness when you came to Him by faith. So forgiveness recognizes that an offense took place. It also realizes that the one offender has also been the source of offense to God, and God has offered forgiveness, right? That's right. So, and 3, forgiveness is releasing someone from a debt because you want something else besides bitterness and anger and frustration and sleeplessness. For forgiveness says, from my point of view, even if the other person is not repentant, I want something different. I want to serve as a conduit for God's grace and glory. I want to recreate this relationship, and I want the glory of the Lord, the grace of the Lord, to be an agent of forgiveness, because we are called to this. This is our calling. We were called to be agents, to manifest the forgiveness and the grace of the Lord. 5 is forgiveness may require practice, but it leads to both a beautiful inward and outward transformation. Let me repeat this. Becoming a forgiving person is the goal. Not excusing it, but saying, why would I expect to go through life and not be offended by someone in my family, even my husband or my wife or my kids? Why would I go through life and remotely assume that I'm not going to be offended, knowing that everybody's a sinner? That's unrealistic. It's also unrealistic for you to suppose you have not been the source of frustration, of coldness, of distance, of sarcasm, of gossip. You're as guilty as other people. Maybe not exactly the same, but you and I have our own share. Yet God has released us, not excused us, but offered forgiveness through the person of Christ. So our forgiveness towards others is doing for others what God has done for us and fulfilling our divine calling. We have been sent into the world to do this. What's the difference between your level of forgiveness and an atheist if you hold grudges? You see, it is your superiority, as painful as this is, it is your self-righteousness and your superiority, your sense of superiority, that causes you to hang on to the grudge because you feel like they deserve your wrath. I need you to separate hurt, which is genuine, and I'm not marginalizing that. But even with your hurt, you look deeply into the eyes of your offender and you say, you know what? I am offended. It does sting. But I realize, you know what? I've been guilty as well. And God has offered me forgiveness. It's a divine calling to offer forgiveness. Now, like anything else, becoming a forgiving person, theologically, relationally, and emotionally, speaks of your depth. Nevertheless, Christ should be formed in you. God intends that His born-again children serve as conduits of His glory and grace. It is not excusing someone who has done you wrong. It is, in fact, releasing them from a debt that they probably do owe you because you are seeking a different relationship. You can be freed from the hurt and the pain and the bondage of it all by willfully choosing to say, I know I have been sent as an agent of God's grace and His glory and His forgiveness. It is God that worketh in you both to will and to do of His good pleasure. It is not His will for us to hold one another as emotional hostages. It is His will for us, as His risen children, to forgive one another as Christ has forgiven us, knowing full well that each of us has needed God's forgiveness in the past, maybe today, and we're certainly going to need it into the future. Forgiveness is a characteristic that leads you to the place where you realize that God not only wants you to consider the act of forgiveness, but you and I were called to a life of forgiveness. It is part of our discipleship. It is part of our risen nature. It is a part of us affirming we understand God's forgiveness in such a way that we are willing to forgive others. We understand God's grace because we are offering it to others. We are not satisfied with holding each other as emotional hostages for things done in the past. Now, I would encourage you to reread the notes that I'm posting and do the quick review that I'm posting at the bottom. Any questions, I'll be more than willing to answer. You have been called by God, chosen by God, to demonstrate His grace and glory, and to be a conduit of His forgiveness. What a joyful thing to the Father when He sees His children doing for one another what Christ has done for us, agents of God's forgiveness. It's a beautiful inward and outward transformation to be released for a greater calling of forgiveness and recreating relationships. Okay? Hope this has been a help to you. God bless.